Well, happy Wednesday, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of a study that we're calling For Such a Time as This. We are reading verse by verse through the story of Esther, which is one of my favorite Old Testament stories and one that I bet many of you are very familiar with, or at least you think you are. And as we get deeper into this, I hope that you'll be surprised by some details that you might not have really thought of before or noticed before. So as we go through this story, we've just got to make sure that we're hearing the right things. You know, there's an old story that's told in church a lot of times about a guy who spent his first night in jail. And that first night, all the inmates gathered together in the courtyard, and someone stepped in the middle and they just shouted a number. And all the inmates started to laugh, and then the next person stepped up and shouted a number, number 5, and everybody started to laugh. And they just did this on and on and on. So when the man returned to his cell, he asked his cellmate, what was that all about? And his cellmate said, well, that's the way that we tell jokes around here, We know all the jokes. We've heard them 100 times. There's the same group of people every day. And so instead of wasting time retelling them, we number them. And then when somebody calls out a number, we all remember what it is and we laugh. And so the next evening, the same thing happened. And after a few numbers were called, this new guy thought he would try his hand at joke telling. And in a quiet moment, he shouted out a number 11. And nobody laughed. And so when they returned to their cell, he asked his cellmate, what was that all about? What happened? And his cellmate said, well, you know how it is. Some people can tell them, some people can't. When it comes to stories in the Bible, a lot of times we feel, that at least those of us who grew up in church feel, like we might know these stories by heart, like we might know them by number, Just shout 1 for the story of Noah and his ark, or shout 2 for the story of Moses at the Red Sea. Shout 3 for the story of David and Goliath, or 4 for Jonah, and so on and so on. And so just say the number and we'll all remember, and that's enough, because there is this familiarity with these stories that kind of make us cold to them. And because of that, maybe we miss out on some of the finer details of these stories. One of the big mistakes that we make when we read stories in the Bible, and this plays into tonight's Esther story, one of the big mistakes we make is that we tend to make heroes out of people in the Bible without really examining how heroic they are. For instance, when I was little, I couldn't even imagine a bigger hero in the Bible than Samson. He reminded me of somebody out of Super Friends. There's this strong, confident, nearly invincible guy. And even the story about his hair intrigued me because it seemed like Superman and kryptonite, And at the end of the story, I was pretty sure the good guy won, and that was it. It wasn't until a lot of years later that I realized Samson was not really such a good guy. He was a guy who was used by God. There's no doubt about that. And God used him in a big way, and by the end of his story, I feel like Samson was somebody who learned some very valuable lessons, like his arc as a human really came along, but he was not the person in life that I thought he was when I was young. Another great example is Jacob in the Old Testament. Most people assume that Jacob must be this super spiritual role model for us. After all, God held Jacob in high esteem. Throughout the Old Testament, God introduced himself as, I am the Lord your God, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And of course, Jacob's name was eventually changed to Israel. He was the father of the Jewish people. You read that and you think, he must be a great guy. But then when you spend time studying his life, you find out that Jacob had more than a few issues. In fact, for much of his life, he was a complete train wreck. He was a deceiver, and he was a schemer, and he was a doubter, and he was a really terrible father, and his careless favoritism is what led to Joseph's brothers nearly killing him along the way, and his stubborn refusal to look up nearly prevented him from traveling to Egypt to escape the famine. That's not what you would think of when you think about heroes of the faith. And yet, get this. In spite of everything, if you go to Hebrews 11 and you read about the Faith Hall of Fame, there's Samson's name in there. And there's Jacob's name in there. And that's important because both of these guys taught us important things in their life, but they did it not as superheroes, not even as heroes. They did it as real people, people who had highs and lows, people who got tangled up in the carnal world around them, but found out that God's grace was big enough even for them. All right, this is important. The heroes of the Bible, most of them aren't very heroic. They are real people, just like you and me. And I'm saying that obviously because as we get deeper into the story of Esther, tonight we're going to be introduced to Esther and Mordecai. And those two people are just like that. They are real people. See, our inclination is to take the story of Esther and turn it into this Cinderella, rags to riches love story where this sweet, poor young orphan girl meets the king and they fall in love instantly and they dance for hours in the woods while all the woodland creatures crowd around them and frolic and play. And then they return to the castle and they live happily ever after. And oh, by the way, if the wicked stepmother or the king's evil advisor, Haman, if he has to be taught a lesson along the way, so much the better. I mean, what a great bedtime story. Isn't it cool that it's in the Bible, which means that it really happened? That's what we want to do with the story of Esther. The problem is, you can't do that. It's not that story, because if you really stop and think about what's happening as we read today, none of those characters are those people. These are real people. And as we get into this, I'm going to say this right up front. Some of you aren't going to like it, but here's the deal. Esther is not that girl that I just described. She's not a Disney princess, all right? Or at least it doesn't seem like that to me. And Mordecai is not this wise, spiritually mature guardian who's always whispering in her ear and pointing her toward God, and the story is not a fairy tale. In fact, it's not even close. If you really want to categorize the story in a modern way, instead of thinking of like a Disney fairy tale, think about like a reality show. I mean, that's more like what's happening here. If television had been invented at this time in history, and reality shows have made an appearance, then the show One Night with the King would have been a blockbuster. I mean, I can imagine this in my mind. It would have a format similar to The Bachelor, and there would be a castle full of beautiful female contestants waiting for their date with the king and hoping that he would give them a rose at the end. And of course, it would have this over The Bachelor. The Bachelor would be the king. I mean, the guy that all these women are fighting for would be the king of the land. I mean, can you imagine what would happen if, like, Prince William or Prince Harry was on The Bachelor one season? Can you imagine the ratings? I mean, that's what this chapter is describing. It is a contest. And it is a disturbingly lewd, carnal contest that's designed to pick the new queen of Persia. And one of the contestants in this contest is our favorite young lass. It's a pretty Jewish girl named Esther. All right, so if you have your Bible in front of you, turn to Esther chapter 2. Remember that last week we read the story, and you need to go back and find that if you didn't get to join us last week. It's right here on YouTube. You can just go back and find week 2 of this. But the story last week is that King Xerxes, who was very powerful, very rich, very egotistical, very power-hungry, all of that, King Xerxes had a party that really lasted like half a year. Like, he did quarantine back then. They just sheltered at place in the palace. They had this lavish party that lasted like 6 months, and it was a power display where he was trying to convince everyone that he was worthy of taking their country to war with Greece. And that, as the party wound down, there was actually like another party that started right after it. It's like the after party. And in that party, the king demanded that his wife Vashti appear before all of his friends completely naked except for her crown. The king was very drunk. His friends were very drunk. She was humiliated, and she refused to come. And the king was so upset that on the advice of his advisors, he got rid of her. She was no more, and now he needs a different king. This is our queen. This is where we're going to pick up, Esther chapter 2. It says, later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done, and what he had decreed about her. Now, the first word that you see there is the word later. So what does later mean? I mean, you remember the last chapter, and then you've got to remember that what we're reading right now did not happen the next day. In fact, 4 years have passed. 4 years have passed since the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. The curtain closed on chapter 1. As it rises again, is 4 years later. And during those 4 years, Xerxes led the largest Persian army in history in an attempt to accomplish what his father could never do. It was to conquer Greece. And actually, one inscription reveals that he intended to conquer Europe as well. I mean, we can be glad that he didn't do that, but he also didn't conquer Greece. He just tried to. The Greeks actually routed the Persian army. They demolished most of the navy. Xerxes eventually boarded a ship and sailed home very sullen and dispirited and humiliated. And when he got home, he walked in his house and it was empty. Okay, that's not actually true. We know historically that the kings had concubines. They also had lesser wives. But there were wives of higher rank who could wear the crown at any time, depending on the king's wishes and whims. Well, his favorite of all of these women had been Vashti. Apparently, he actually had feelings for her, and so now as he returns from this miserable campaign, he looks around the palace and Vashti is gone. And so there's just this void in the royal palace as well as in his heart as he regrets his decision to banish her. And in fact, the Hebrew construction of this verse that you're looking at, the Hebrew construction of this strongly implies that he is now blaming his 7 counselors for persuading him to banish his queen. He's upset. He's not in a good mood. His troops have been depleted, along with all his money and his war chest. His credibility throughout the empire has been diminished. His title of King of Kings has been lost. And now he returns home and his favorite wife is gone. And so it's no wonder that his 7 counselors quickly come up with what they believe is an intriguing proposition. It's beginning in verse 2. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. And then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." And this advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. All right, now if you're trying to figure out what does all of this say, if somebody asked you to paraphrase it, how would you do that? What is their advice? Think about it like this. "Listen, O great king, why don't we have a kingdom-wide beauty contest and you find another queen?" What do you say? I mean, that's the crux of this. And it's an odd idea because Persian custom actually required that the queen be related to one of the 7 noble families. That was part of their law. But these counselors seem very eager to bend the rules on this one, maybe because they just want to change the king's mood. And either way, the king agrees, and this proclamation is made. Now, if you're thinking that this contest probably drew like a huge pool of applicants, you might be right, because this competition is like shows like The Bachelor. It's like that. The competition would be pretty stiff. So I can't help thinking that lots of citizens of Persia saw this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Anyone can become a princess. Who will it be? There's must have been these long lines of girls in the streets hoping to catch the eye of the king's attendants. Maybe. But there is a little more to this than you see on the surface. There's an underside of all of this that made this maybe a little less attractive to many girls. To understand why, we've got to do some skipping. We're in verse 4. Let's skip ahead right now to verse 12 so you can see what this contest really is. Okay? Verse 12. "Before a young woman's turn came to go in to King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem to the care of Shagaj, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. Now look, I don't usually like to read out of order here, but in this case, before we meet Esther, I want to explain what's really happening in this contest, because there's no way to sanitize it, all right? This is what it is, and you can read between the lines in these verses that we just read. You can read between the lines as well as I can, okay? Each one of these girls was a virgin when she went to the palace. That was one of the requirements. And because the Persians consider beauty treatments to be a spiritual exercise, they would receive 12 months of beauty regimen, all right? And the priests in this region were the ones who developed and protected the science of cosmetics, and because they saw the physical as a gateway to the spiritual, they believed that cleanliness was next to godliness. All right, so this was a big deal. The women were bathed in pools of spices since smells were connected to divine acceptance. Women wore makeup around their eyes, bracelets around their arms and necks, and feet to ward off evil spirits. They were given rouge for their cheeks, all shades of lipstick and eyeliner and fingernail polish, because beauty brought them closer to the gods. And so for 12 months, they were kept out of the sunlight, and they went through this regimen. And then at the prescribed time, they would be taken to the king. And it was pretty safe to assume that they weren't virgins when they left his presence the next morning. Instead, they would be led to a part of the palace where the king's concubines lived, and that is where they would spend the rest of their life. And unless the king asked for you by name, you would probably never spend time with him again. And you couldn't marry, you belonged to the king, and so that's where you would live out the rest of your life. I mean, do you get it? The winner gets to be queen. All the rest, and many historians believe that there were many, many hundreds of girls, and all of the rest were sent away. And all this to say, I can't believe that all of these girls went voluntarily. I don't know about Esther. I mean, you can't read too much into the verb that says she was taken to the palace, because it's not a word that indicates that she was taken against her will. We're just not told. But however it happened, this is the place in the story where we're introduced to this girl and her uncle. Verse 5. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hegai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who was in charge of the harem. Esther, let me stop right there. I want to stop at that verse. Now, the name Hadassah, that's Esther's real name. That name refers to the flower of a myrtle bush. All right, Esther was her pagan name, and it's most likely a transliteration of Ishtar, the Babylonian goddess of love. Esther is an orphan. She's being raised here by her uncle Mordecai. We don't know here whether he willingly entered her in the contest. I mean, I don't get that feeling, but I don't know. But what we know is she was chosen to go to the palace. And so we read that when his order, look at this again, that when the king's order had been proclaimed, that many young women were brought there, Esther was taken there and placed in the charge of this harem. Which means that if you turned to Persian TV, you probably would have considered Esther a long shot to win the contest. I mean, think about it. She was beautiful, but she was also an orphan. And on top of that, she was a Jew, which would have been a huge strike against her, except for one little detail. Nobody knew. In verse 10, it says that Esther had not revealed her nationality and her family background. because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. What do you make out of that? I mean, what do you make out of the fact that she is hiding her heritage, that she's hiding the fact that she's a Jew? I got to be honest, this sort of troubles me. And I don't understand that culture all the way through. I mean, I don't know what it was like for them. And I will say it was not a sin for her to keep her nationality quiet. I mean, if nobody asked her, I don't guess she's under some compulsion to reveal it. But having said that, it is a little troubling that no one knew that she was Jewish. I mean, just take this right on the surface. What that means is that she and Mordecai had not been keeping the Jewish laws or customs. It means that they had just assimilated into Persian culture. They have blended in with everyone else. See, don't forget by this time, Ezra had already taken the first group of Jews back to Jerusalem. But many of these Jews had become so comfortable in Persia that they preferred to stay. The exile had ended, but a lot of them were staying voluntarily. Mordecai had stayed. And obviously, he was living in a way that looked just like everyone else in a pagan culture. I think that's unfortunate. And as we see this scene go forward, we're going to see that Esther is the same. If you remember all the way back, if you're familiar with the book of Daniel, when Daniel was forced, he was taken captive, he was put in the palace in Babylon, he was trained by Nebuchadnezzar's advisors. If you remember in Daniel 1, he and his friends refused to eat the king's food because they said it violates our dietary laws. They took a stand, and God had blessed their boldness, and they found favor with their teachers, and Daniel soon rose to the head of the class. Well, that's not what Esther does. Esther does find favor in the palace. And I do think that it's because God is opening doors for her. But it's not because she takes a stand for God. On the contrary, she is hiding her faith. And she's obviously not keeping Jewish practices. She's eating whatever is given to her. She's preparing herself to be bound to a Gentile king. So how much was her choice? We don't know. And we're not told, but there's nothing here that indicates that this is against her will, and there's nothing here that commends her character. We don't read anything that says, oh, Esther was just such a good, devout girl. The only real commendation we get for her is her outward beauty. Okay? So at this point, I don't really see Esther as a Bible hero, not yet. At this point, she isn't Daniel or Joseph. She's one of the girls. And she's quickly rising through the ranks. Now, that is not to say that it's an equal playing field, because we know that in that culture especially, I mean, good grief, it was different rules for Esther and Daniel. All right, and her beauty was something that she could use, and she had very few things at her disposal. So I get that. Okay, I'm not really being quite as judgmental as I sound on this. I'm just making the statement that at this point we're not looking at a character here who is living boldly for the Lord in a culture that's a pagan culture. It sure seems like she and Mordecai are in hiding. All right? So let's keep reading. I'm going backwards now. I'm going to pick up some verses we just read. Esther was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately, he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned her to 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. All right, so you get that? She immediately finds favor with Hegai. And he moves her to the top of the class. And within a matter of hours, Esther has given her own private suite and 7 maids and plenty to eat and drink. And she has all the advantages, and then her name is called. Verse 15. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Hegai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And so as Mordecai paces uncomfortably back and forth in the courtyard around the palace, Esther is led into the presence of the king, and thankfully we aren't given any of the sordid details, but here's how it ends. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. And so he set a royal crown on her head, and he made her queen instead of Vashti. And just like that, Esther is crowned queen. Just like that, Esther's crowned queen. Now don't get lost in the fairy tale. The king is not in love with her here. He is attracted to her. All right, if this was a love story, then he would dismiss all of the other girls and set his eyes on Esther. That's obviously not what happened. In fact, we learn later that another group of girls was brought in after Esther was crowned. So this wasn't his true love, but he liked her. And I like to think that he liked her for more than her looks. I just have to think that there was an inner beauty that shone through as well. In fact, I do think that. I think there is a lot of character in this girl that's just waiting to come to the surface. And as we see Esther's true character revealed in the story, we're going to see that there's way more she had way more going for her than just good looks. For now, though, this is where we are. Young Esther, who is not our spiritual or moral role model at this moment, has been put in a position where God is going to help her grow a lot. He is going to give her a chance to be used in a mighty way, and she will be up to the challenge, which just goes to prove this, that God works through faithful people and God works in spite of unfaithful people. Let me say that again. God works through faithful people and He works in spite of unfaithful people. He is unstoppable. He sheds His grace on us even when we don't deserve it, and thank goodness that's true. And that doesn't mean, of course, that we can all just sin and do whatever we want so that grace will pile up more and more. It's not that. We don't just have like some license to sin. But the amazing truth is that even when we disobey God, which is daily, even when you and I are not faithful, God never leaves us or forsakes us. And that is what Esther is about to find out in the story. In fact, it's what all of these Jews who had stayed in this area are about to find out. Esther has been drenched in more than myrrh and Persian spices. She is drenched in the grace of God. The aroma of His kindness toward her permeates through the pages of this story from cover to cover, because in spite of her disobedience, in spite of the fact that she keeps her heritage a secret, in spite of everything that's happening, God has turned the heart of that dirty old man that He chose and that He put on the throne. God has turned His heart so that He chose her to be queen. So don't miss this. God is the one who placed Esther on the throne. It's not Xerxes. He didn't choose her because she was more beautiful than the others or because she was special in His eyes. He chose her because God is going to use her to bring about the salvation of His people. And think about it. God was the one who gave Esther her beauty in the first place. God was the one who gave her a rich Jewish heritage. God is the one who placed her in Persia at just such an opportune time. And even though He is never the author of evil, God is the one who used even this sin-plagued contest for His own purposes. And why? Because He had made a great promise to Israel's forefathers that He would make a great nation out of them and that from them He would bring forth the Savior of the world. And so nothing, not even the so-called king of the world, could stand in the way of that. And what Esther is going to learn, along with you and I, is that when God makes a promise, He keeps it. And nothing can stand in His way. And we're also going to learn something about heroes, namely that they don't exist. Okay, the hero of the story is God Himself. And maybe it does read like a fairy tale. I mean, maybe it does. God is the perfect king who loves the poor beggars like us. And He gives everything for us, including His own life. And He promises that one day we'll be with Him in paradise and that we'll live happily ever after. And in light of that, I just think you and I can put up with this reality show for a little bit longer. Next week, we will pick up the story right there. I hope you're enjoying this. Like I said this last week, and I appreciated those of you who reached out. If you're enjoying this, or if you have questions or comments, please email me. It's Matthew@Pinedale.church. I love to hear from you. If this is meaningful to you, share it with somebody else. We'll pick up this story next Wednesday night. It should be live at 5 or 5:30, something like that. In the meantime, I'm looking forward to seeing you in this room again. But until then, let's try to stay in contact. And if I can be in any way a help for you, reach out. I'd love to hear from you. Goodbye.